this video, we'll be making gluten-free pumpkin scones. I love fall, and not just because of the baked goods, but mostly because of the baked goods. These pumpkin scones are soft, buttery, and have the perfect amount of pumpkin spice. So let's get started. The first thing we're gonna do is prepare our milk, butter, and pumpkin to set aside. So I have a half a cup of cold butter, which I've cubed. Then you're gonna take 1/3 cup of heavy cream. You can also use milk or non-dairy milk, but the high fat content really makes these scones nice and rich, so I recommend it. You're gonna take 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar, pour it into the milk, and give it a little stir. The vinegar is going to react with the baking powder in the recipe, which is gonna give your scones even more lift. So I'm gonna take my cream and my butter and go put it in the fridge. Now we're going to measure and blot our pumpkin. So we're gonna take a half a cup of pureed pumpkin, measure it out. I'm just leveling mine off with the back of a butter knife to make sure it's nice and precise. You're gonna use a paper towel, or if you're like me and ran out of paper towel in the middle of a pandemic, use a Christmas napkin. The reason why we're blotting the pumpkin is because when you're making something like a scone, you don't want too high of a moisture content or you won't get the right texture. It'll be more like a muffin than a scone. So we want to get a bit of the moisture out of the pumpkin before we add it to the other ingredients. I spread out my napkin or paper towel in the bowl, and let's just scoop the pumpkin into it. Now just wrap your pumpkin up in your napkin or paper towel. I like to flip mine over. And we're just gonna let that sit while we mix our dry ingredients together. This recipe uses a mixture of 2 flours and 2 starches. 1 cup of white rice flour. I like to use white rice flour in this recipe because it has a neutral flavor, which allows the pumpkin to shine through. Then we have a half a cup of almond flour. Almond flour is great for several reasons. It helps with browning, flavor, and texture. A 1/4 cup of cornstarch. Cornstarch will give it a really light texture and also give it a bit of that crumbly, biscuity texture. And a 1/4 cup of potato starch. This starch will help make them soft and fluffy. Now we have a few other ingredients that need to go in here. We have a half a teaspoon of xanthan gum. Xanthan gum is key in binding your gluten-free baked goods together. A half a teaspoon of salt, a 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, which is key in getting your scones to rise in the oven, as well as 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1½ teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. Now let's whisk it all together. In a separate bowl, we're going to mix together all of our liquid ingredients. First up, let's crack our egg and give that a whisk. Now let's mix in our blotted pumpkin. It doesn't look pretty, but you can tell that it's quite a bit drier than it was before you blotted it. Let's put that in. Give it a quick whisk. Now pour in your cream and vinegar. Then you're going to add 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. If you can find dark maple syrup, that's what I would recommend here to get the most flavor, but anything is fine. 1½ teaspoons of vanilla extract. And let's just keep on mixing until everything looks nice and smooth. Looks good. All right, now we're gonna cut our butter into the flour mixture. Take your cubed butter and scrape it into the bowl. I like to cut my butter in with a pastry blender. If you don't have a pastry blender, you can also do it by hand. Just make sure you don't work it too much and melt all of your butter. You could also take a stick of frozen butter and grate it in, or you could even use a food processor. There's lots of ways to do it, but this is my favorite. So just take your pastry blender and cut straight down into the mixture. We want to just keep cutting it in until the butter is in lentil-sized pieces. Get it all off. I sound like my theme music. Okay, let me show you what this looks like. So it's all incorporated. There are a few slightly bigger chunks of butter, but generally they're all pretty small. As I said, lentil-sized. Now, grab a fork. If you haven't done your dishes in a little bit, you only have little forks left, anything will do. And we're going to slowly pour our liquid over the mixture and toss it with our fork. Pour in about 1/3 of the mixture to start. Toss it around. A little more. This is where that pumpkin spice smell starts wafting. Oh, keep mixing it up. You want to just keep mixing it until all the flour has been moistened by the liquid. The nice thing about gluten-free baking is that you don't have to worry about over developing the gluten here. Really, I just don't want to melt my pieces of butter, but you're not going to get a tough biscuit if you mix it too much. Like you would with regular baking. Gluten-free perks. Never thought you'd hear that. So now I'm just going to scrape down the sides of my bowl. So here is my finished scone dough. Oh, it smells so good. Now I'm going to cover this bowl and put it into the fridge for at least 30 minutes. So there's two reasons why we do this. The first is that it's going to be easier to work with the dough once it's chilled. And the second reason is because gluten-free flours need a bit more time to absorb the liquid in the recipe. So let's cover the bowl. If you're going to make this ahead of time, a few hours or more, you might want to use something like plastic wrap to really press it into the dough so it doesn't dry out. But because I'm only putting mine in for 30 minutes, a towel will be just fine. Now let's talk about a few different ways that you can bake your scones. Probably the easiest way to make scones that have a perfect shape with the least hassle is to use a scone pan like this. I got this for about $45 on Amazon. I realized that not everybody has a scone pan. In fact, up until about a month ago, I didn't have a scone pan. So let me show you another way that works just as well. We are going to use a 9-inch round cake pan. As you may notice, they're the same size. And we're going to line it with some parchment paper, which I'm going to do in a second, and also have a baking sheet like this very dirty one that I have handy because we're going to transfer it. Now to prepare your cake pan, we're going to first grease it with a little bit of butter. This is going to help the parchment paper stay in place, nice and greased. Then you're going to take a big piece of parchment, bigger than you would think you would need, and you're just going to press it into the pan. Fold it over the sides a little bit, like so. When you're baking these gluten-free scones, there's a bit more liquid than you would have in regular gluten scones to give them more moisture. But because you don't have the structure of gluten, they will spread out on the pan, which is why I'm not suggesting that you just bake them on a baking sheet because you won't get that perfect shape. Now that your scone dough has finished chilling, go and preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's prepare our working surface. You're going to want to use a cutting board or something you can cut on. And you're just going to put a little bit of rice flour down and spread it out. That was quite a lot of rice flour. I'm just going to spread it out to the sides. Okay, and now take your scone dough, put it on your surface. Now I like to sprinkle a tiny bit more flour onto the top, and we're going to flatten this into a round disc. It's very sticky. You don't want to touch it too much because you don't want to melt the butter. Having those pockets of butter is going to make your scones nice and flaky and delicious. Put a tiny bit more flour over top and grab a piece of wax paper, put it over top, and we're going to very gently roll out the top. We don't want to squish it down too much. This is just to get the top of it nice and flat. Go in all directions. So peel off the wax paper, and we're just going to reshape it a tiny bit more with our hands, making sure that it's a nice round circle. Kind of push together any cracks that you have on the sides. Just for reference, it's about 1 inch smaller than the cake pan. Take a very sharp knife, a big one like this, if you have it, is great. And we're going to cut it into 8 even pieces. So the best way to do this is to cut it in half, then cut it in half the other way. Now that it's in quarters, we're going to cut each of those again in half. Now we're going to transfer each scone into the prepared pan. If they're not coming out, just make sure that it's completely cut. There we go. We're basically just going to recreate this shape, but have it a bit more spaced out. Now that our scones are ready in the pan, we're just going to brush them with a little bit more cream. This is going to give them a nice sheen and also help to crisp up the tops. Another thing that you can do is just take a little bit of coarse sugar and you can just sprinkle it on the tops, which is also going to give them that nice What is this word I'm looking for? Like the crunchy, like the nice, oops. The nice crunchy exterior, the nice crisp, beautiful textured top. All right, these are ready for the oven, so I'm gonna go put them in for about 20 minutes. Okay, so it's been 20 minutes. As you can see, they've all kind of risen together and they're touching, which is why we're going to move them onto the other pan. I'm actually gonna be brave and just grab the parchment and move them over. Now we just need to separate them. You can use a knife if you need to. This is not something you would do when you're normally making scones, but because the gluten-free scones don't have gluten to give them the structure, this is how you get the rise and the shape. Okay, so just carefully spread them out so they're no longer touching and they can firm up a bit on the sides. Great, and back into the oven for another 5 minutes. All right, our scones are all done. As you can see, the tops are nice and golden brown and the sides have firmed up just a little bit. As they cool, they'll firm up even more and they smell like heaven. So now I'm just gonna transfer them to my cooling rack. Now we're gonna let these cool until they're no longer warm to the touch. This way, when we put our glaze on, the glaze won't melt right off of them. While our scones are cooling, let's whip up a delicious maple glaze. This is really simple. All you need is 1 tablespoon of melted butter. To that, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. Again, if you can find a delicious dark maple syrup, that's the best thing to use. Lick your spoon. We're also gonna add a little pinch of salt. This glaze actually tastes like the most delicious maple fudge. Oh, it's so good. And now we have a 1/2 cup of icing sugar. Let's just sprinkle it in little by little. And I'm just whisking with a fork. So that's too thin. Just keep adding. All right, let's see how that's looking. A bit too thick. So I'm just gonna add a tiny bit more maple syrup to that. Nothing wrong with a little extra maple. There. See how I'm able to drizzle that on? That'll be great. My scones have now cooled, so they're ready for the drizzle. I'm actually gonna go grab that piece of parchment paper and I'm gonna put it under, oh my God. Let's try that again, shall we? Back to ones, people. Okay, I'm gonna put it under the rack just so there's less mess. So get a little bit on your fork and drizzle it on. You can't be too tentative here. You need to just go for it. Oh, beauty. All right, it's time for the best part, the taste test. So beautiful. I almost don't want to ruin it, except I do. It's like a mouthful of autumn. The texture is amazing. It's got the right amount of moisture, but still has that scone crumble. The pumpkin shines through beautifully. Oh, so good. There you have it, gluten-free pumpkin scones. Perfect for fall or any time of the year. If you tried this recipe, send me a message and let me know how they turned out. Or you can share them on Instagram and tag me at Gluten-free Baking Courses. And now to devour the rest of this scone. Happy baking!